Staff Sergeant Kira Blackwood adjusted the stack of requisition forms on her desk, her movements precise despite the mundane nature of the task. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the supply depot at Naval Base Coronado, casting long shadows across the concrete floor where boxes of equipment waited for distribution. She had been assigned to logistics coordination for the past 6 months, a role that many assumed suited her perfectly. Clean, organized, away from the more demanding aspects of military service that some believed were better left to others. The sound of boots echoing against concrete announced the arrival of the visitors she had been expecting. SEAL Team 7 was rotating back from deployment, and their gear needed processing before they could stand down. Kira looked up from her paperwork as the first of them entered the depot, their desert camouflage still bearing the dust of distant operations. Lieutenant Commander Jake Torino led the group, his weathered face scanning the depot with the automatic assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating tactical situations. Behind him followed 6 other operators, each carrying the casual confidence that came with surviving missions most people could never imagine. Their conversation was low but audible, filled with the technical jargon and dark humor that bonded men who had faced death together. Torino approached Kira's desk with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to efficiency. When he spoke, his voice carried the clipped authority of a career military officer who expected immediate compliance. "Good morning, Sergeant. We need to process our equipment return and get our personal gear sorted for transport." Kira stood and nodded professionally. "Of course, sir. I have the inventory sheets prepared and the processing area cleared. If you and your team could begin by separating personal items from issued equipment, we can move through this efficiently." One of the SEAL operators, a muscular man with close-cropped hair and arms that strained against his uniform sleeves, glanced at his teammates with barely concealed amusement. Petty Officer First Class Danny Morse had a reputation for speaking his mind, and the slight smirk on his face suggested he had opinions about their current situation. "This should be interesting," he said to the operator beside him, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure Kira could hear. "Wonder if she knows the difference between a rifle and a paperweight." The comment drew quiet chuckles from several team members, and Kira felt the familiar tension that came with being underestimated. She had experienced this countless times before, the assumption that her gender and current assignment automatically disqualified her from understanding the tools and techniques of combat operations. Rather than respond directly, she simply pulled up the detailed inventory on her computer screen, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Before we dive into this process," she said while accessing the equipment database, "drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have witnessed similar situations where assumptions were made about someone's capabilities in your military community." The irony of the moment was not lost on her, as she prepared to demonstrate just how thoroughly she understood every piece of equipment they were about to process. Torino seemed more focused on efficiency than on his team's commentary, but Kira noticed his slight frown as Morse continued his observations. The lieutenant commander had worked with enough military personnel to recognize competence when he saw it, and something in Kira's bearing suggested there might be more to her than met the eye. However, his immediate concern was completing their processing and getting his men to their well-deserved downtime. As the team began unloading their equipment, Kira moved between the various stations with fluid precision, checking serial numbers, verifying inventory counts, and noting the condition of each item. Her movements were economical and purposeful, betraying a familiarity with military hardware that went beyond simple administrative training. When she picked up an M4A1 carbine to inspect its condition, her handling was textbook perfect, checking the chamber, examining the barrel, and assessing the weapon with the eye of someone who understood its capabilities intimately. Morse noticed her technique and elbowed the operator beside him. "Look at that, Rico. She hold it like she actually knows what it is." His tone suggested this was somehow surprising, as if competent weapon handling was beyond the expectations for someone in a logistics role. Staff Sergeant Rico Valdez, a compact man with intelligent eyes and multiple deployment patches on his sleeve, was more observant than his teammate. He watched Kira's movements with growing interest, noting details that Morse seemed to miss. The way she balanced the weapon, the automatic safety check, the professional assessment of its condition, all spoke to training that went well beyond basic military requirements. Kira completed her inspection and made notes on her checklist, her expression remaining neutral despite the ongoing commentary. She had learned early in her military career that the best response to doubt was simply competent performance. Words rarely changed minds, but actions had a way of speaking for themselves. As the morning progressed, more equipment was processed, and the team settled into the routine of inventory and documentation. Conversations flowed around topics of deployment experiences, upcoming leave plans, and speculation about future assignments. The depot filled with the sounds of military life, equipment being moved, forms being completed, and the casual banter of soldiers transitioning from operational to administrative mode. Torino watched the process unfold with professional satisfaction. Despite his team's initial skepticism, the processing was moving smoothly and efficiently. Kira seemed to anticipate their needs, had the proper forms readily available, and demonstrated a level of organization that made their lives easier rather than more complicated. In his experience, good logistics support was worth its weight in gold, regardless of who provided it. However, the underlying tension remained. Several team members continued their quiet observations about their current handler, making assumptions based on limited information and preconceived notions. They saw her current role and made judgments about her overall capabilities, never considering that military careers often involved multiple specializations and that appearances could be deceiving. Kira was well aware of their assessment. She had faced similar situations throughout her military service and had learned to use skepticism as motivation rather than allowing it to become discouragement. Every doubt expressed was simply another opportunity to demonstrate competence, and every assumption made was another chance to exceed expectations when the moment arrived. The morning sun climbed higher, and the depot grew warmer as the team worked through their equipment. Sweat began to bead on foreheads as the physical demands of moving heavy gear took their toll. For men accustomed to peak physical conditioning, the work was manageable but noticeable, and several comments were made about the California heat and their eagerness to complete the process. As boxes were moved and inventories were checked, Kira maintained her professional demeanor while internally cataloging every comment, every assumption, and every dismissive glance. She had been in situations like this before, and experience had taught her that patience was often rewarded with opportunity. The question was not whether that opportunity would come, but when, and whether she would be ready to seize it when it arrived. The afternoon heat intensified as SEAL Team 7 continued processing their equipment, and with it, the casual commentary about their surroundings grew more pointed. Petty Officer Danny Morse had found his rhythm, making observations that drew knowing looks from his teammates, while Kira methodically worked through her checklist. The dynamic had settled into a familiar pattern that she recognized from previous assignments, where her competence was measured against assumptions rather than performance. Morse hefted a tactical vest loaded with magazine pouches and ceramic plates, the weight causing him to adjust his stance slightly. "This thing must weigh 40 pounds, he said to Rico Valdez, who was sorting through night vision equipment nearby. "Bet our logistics coordinator here has never had a hump gear like this over rough terrain." Valdez glanced at Kira, who was currently inspecting a precision rifle scope with the careful attention of someone who understood its technical specifications. Unlike his more vocal teammate, Rico had begun to notice details that didn't align with the narrative Morse was constructing. The way she handled equipment spoke to familiarity that went beyond administrative training, and her questions about gear conditions suggested knowledge that came from practical experience rather than textbook study. Kira looked up from the scope, meeting Valdez's gaze briefly before returning to her inspection. She had completed similar evaluations hundreds of times, checking for damage, verifying serial numbers, and ensuring that expensive equipment met the standards required for operational use. Her movements were efficient and professional, betraying no reaction to the ongoing commentary about her presumed limitations. Lieutenant Commander Torino was reviewing deployment schedules on his tablet when his attention was drawn to a conversation between two of his younger operators. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Webb, fresh from his first deployment, was explaining to anyone who would listen how supply personnel never really understood the demands placed on operational equipment. "You see," Webb said, gesturing toward a disassembled communications system, "when you're calling for extraction under enemy fire, you need gear that works perfectly every time. People who have never been downrange do not really comprehend what equipment failure means in life-or-death situations." The comment was clearly intended for Kira's benefit, delivered with the casual arrogance of someone who assumed his audience lacked the experience to challenge his assertions. Webb had developed the habit of using his recent combat experience as a credential to establish superiority over anyone he perceived as having less demanding assignments. Kira continued her work without visible reaction, but internally she was cataloging each assumption and filing it away for future reference. She had learned through experience that direct confrontation rarely changed minds, but demonstrated competence under pressure had a way of adjusting perspectives rapidly. The key was patience and preparation for the moment when opportunity presented itself. As the team worked through their gear, conversations shifted to upcoming training exercises and personnel assignments. Torino mentioned that the team would be participating in a joint training operation with Marine Force Recon and Army Special Forces units, a complex exercise designed to test interoperability between different special operations components. The exercise will test everything from marksmanship to tactical movement under stress, Torino explained to his assembled team. Command wants to evaluate how different units work together when facing realistic combat scenarios. We will be representing naval special warfare, so performance standards will be high. Morse grinned and flexed his considerable shoulders. Should be interesting to see how the other services measure up against SEAL training standards. He glanced toward Kira with barely concealed condescension. Too bad supply personnel do not get to participate in real military exercises. Might give them perspective on what actual military service involves. The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and several team members chuckled appreciatively. Kira felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with being underestimated, but maintained her professional composure while continuing to process equipment. She had faced similar situations throughout her military career, and had learned that the best response was simply superior performance when the opportunity arose. Valdez, however, was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with his teammates' commentary. He had served long enough to recognize competence in unexpected places, and something about Kira's bearing suggested that appearances might be deceiving. The precision of her equipment handling, the confidence of her movement, and the depth of her technical knowledge all pointed to training that went well beyond basic logistics requirements. As the afternoon progressed, the team's gear was systematically processed and prepared for storage or transport. Kira moved between different stations with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and purposeful. She handled everything from advanced optics to specialized communications equipment with the easy familiarity of someone who understood not just their administrative requirements, but their operational applications. When she picked up a suppressed sniper rifle to inspect its condition, her handling was textbook perfect. She checked the bolt action, examined the barrel crown, and assessed the scope mounting system with the trained eye of someone who understood precision shooting at the highest levels. The weapon seemed natural in her hands, as if she had handled similar systems countless times before. Webb noticed her technique and made another comment to his teammates. "Look at her trying to act like she knows what she is holding. Probably thinks that rifle is just an oversized paperweight." Kira completed her inspection and made detailed notes on her evaluation form, her expression remaining neutral despite the ongoing commentary. She had documented the rifle's excellent condition, noting that the barrel showed minimal wear and the optics were properly calibrated. Her assessment was thorough and professional, reflecting a depth of knowledge that would have surprised her critics if they had bothered to pay attention to the details of her work. Torino was beginning to notice the disconnect between his team's assumptions and the quality of service they were receiving. The equipment processing was proceeding more smoothly than he had experienced at most installations, and their logistics coordinator seemed to anticipate needs before they were expressed. Her questions about equipment condition were thoughtful and relevant, suggesting understanding that went beyond simple administrative requirements. As the day wore on, the team's conversation turned to physical fitness standards and training regimens. Morse was particularly vocal about the demanding conditioning required for special operations, making it clear that he believed civilian personnel and support staff could never understand the dedication required to maintain peak physical performance. Most people have no idea what it takes to stay in SEA-level condition, he said while adjusting a weight vest. The physical and mental demands are beyond what 99% of the population can handle. You need dedication that most people simply do not possess. The implication was clear, and Kira felt the familiar challenge that came with being underestimated. She had maintained her own conditioning throughout her military career, regardless of her current assignment, but chose not to engage in verbal sparring that would accomplish nothing beyond creating tension. Actions, she had learned, were far more persuasive than words. As the afternoon moved toward evening, the team began preparing to secure their processed equipment and transition to their off-duty time. The work had proceeded efficiently, and despite their initial skepticism, they had to acknowledge that their logistic support had been competent and professional. However, their fundamental assumptions about Kira's capabilities remained unchanged. Torino approached Kira's desk to complete the final paperwork, his manner professional but distant. The processing has been efficient, Sergeant. Your organization and attention to detail are appreciated. The compliment was genuine but limited, acknowledging her administrative competence while reinforcing her perceived role as support personnel. Kira accepted the praise graciously while internally noting that respect remained conditional and incomplete. She had performed her assigned duties competently, but her broader capabilities remained invisible to those who chose to see only what they expected. As Team 7 prepared to depart, conversations turned to their evening plans and the prospect of relaxation after months of deployment stress. The depot would soon return to its usual quiet routine, and Kira would continue with her administrative responsibilities while the operators transitioned to the less demanding rhythm of stateside duty. However, the underlying tension remained unresolved. Assumptions had been made, judgments had been passed, and stereotypes had been reinforced through selective perception. The team saw what they expected to see and interpreted her competence within the narrow framework of their preconceptions. They left satisfied with their service, but unchanged in their fundamental assessment of her capabilities. Kira watched them depart, while mentally preparing for the challenges that lay ahead. She had faced similar situations before and knew that respect was rarely given freely, but had to be earned through demonstrated excellence under pressure. The question was not whether that opportunity would arise, but when, and whether she would be ready to seize it completely when the moment came. 3 days after SEAL Team 7 completed their equipment processing, word filtered through the base that their joint training exercise had been moved up by 2 weeks. Lieutenant Commander Torino received the notification during his morning briefing, and the news created an immediate shift in the team's preparation timeline. What had been a leisurely transition from deployment to training became an accelerated schedule that demanded immediate attention to readiness standards. The change affected more than just the SEAL team. Support personnel across the base found themselves adjusting schedules and priorities to accommodate the compressed timeline. For Kira, this meant coordinating additional equipment requests, processing expedited supply orders, and managing the logistics complications that came with sudden schedule changes. Her quiet efficiency became even more valuable as various units scrambled to meet new deadlines. Morse arrived at the supply depot that morning with a requisition for specialized ammunition and training aids, his usual swagger slightly tempered by the stress of accelerated preparation. He approached Kira's desk with the paperwork, but his manner retained the casual condescension that had characterized their previous interactions. "We need these items processed immediately," he said, sliding the requisition across her desk. "The training timeline got compressed, so everything needs to move faster than normal. Hope you can handle the increased pace." Kira reviewed the request carefully, noting the quantities and specifications for various types of ammunition, training targets, and simulation equipment. The order was substantial and would require coordination with multiple suppliers, but she had handled similar rush requests before. Her response was calm and professional, betraying no concern about the complexity of the task. "I can have everything ready for pickup by tomorrow afternoon," she replied, already calculating the logistics chain required to meet his timeline. "The ammunition will need to come from the armory, but the training aids can be sourced directly from our warehouse stock." Moore seemed surprised by her confidence, having expected either protests about the short timeline or requests for additional time. He had worked with logistics personnel who became flustered under pressure, and Kira's calm competence did not fit his expectations. However, rather than adjusting his assessment, he simply attributed her response to inexperience with truly demanding situations. "We'll see how that works out," he said with barely concealed skepticism. "These training exercises put a lot more stress on support systems than you might realize. Real military operations do not wait for convenient schedules." The comment was delivered with the patronizing tone of someone explaining reality to a naive subordinate. But Kira simply nodded acknowledgement while beginning to process his request. She had managed logistics support for operations far more complex than training exercises, but saw no benefit in correcting his assumptions. Her reputation would be built through performance, not through verbal justification of her capabilities. As Morse departed, Kira immediately began coordinating the various elements required to fulfill his request. She contacted the armory to arrange ammunition transfer, checked warehouse inventory for training materials, and initiated the paperwork required for expedited processing. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, reflecting experience with complex logistics operations under pressure. Later that morning, Staff Sergeant Rico Valdez arrived at the depot with his own equipment requests, but his approach was noticeably different from his teammates. He had been observing Kira's work over the past few days and had begun to recognize patterns that suggested greater competence than his colleagues assumed. His manner was respectful but curious, as if he was testing a hypothesis about her actual capabilities. "Sergeant Blackwood," he said, reviewing his requisition list, "I need to coordinate some specialized equipment for our marksmanship training. The requirements are pretty specific, and I want to make sure we get exactly what we need." Kira looked over his request, noting that he was asking for precision ammunition, advanced optics, and specialized targets designed for long-range accuracy testing. The specifications were detailed and technical, requiring understanding of ballistics and marksmanship principles that went well beyond basic supply chain management. "I see you are requesting Federal Gold Medal match ammunition in 308 Winchester," she said, scanning the list with obvious understanding. "That is excellent choice for precision work. The 175 grain Sierra Match King bullets in that load have outstanding ballistic coefficients for longer-range shooting." Valdez paused, clearly surprised by her technical knowledge. Most logistics personnel would have simply processed his request without understanding the implications of his equipment choices, but Kira had demonstrated familiarity with advanced marksmanship concepts that suggested practical experience rather than theoretical study. "You know precision ammunition specifications," he said, his tone shifting from casual to genuinely interested. "That is not something most people in supply positions understand in detail." Kira maintained her professional demeanor while continuing to review his request. "I try to understand the equipment I am processing," she replied simply. "It helps me do my job more effectively when I know how different items are actually used in the field." The response was diplomatic, but revealed nothing about the source of her knowledge. Valdez found himself increasingly curious about her background, but recognized that direct questioning would be inappropriate given their professional relationship and relative ranks. Instead, he filed away this additional evidence that there might be more to Sergeant Blackwood than initially apparent. As they worked through the details of his equipment request, their conversation naturally shifted toward technical aspects of marksmanship and equipment performance. Kira demonstrated consistent familiarity with concepts that should have been outside her area of expertise, answering questions and offering observations that reflected practical experience rather than book learning. When Valdez mentioned the challenges of maintaining accuracy at extended ranges, Kira nodded knowingly. Wind reading becomes critical beyond 600 meters, she said while organizing his paperwork. Even slight environmental changes can affect bullet trajectory significantly at those distances. The comment was casual but revealed understanding of advanced marksmanship principles that most people learned only through extensive practical training. Valdez found himself wondering where she had acquired such knowledge, but chose not to pursue the question directly. Instead, he simply made mental notes about the growing contradictions between his team's assumptions and the evidence of her actual capabilities. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Petty Officer Webb, who had come to check on the status of various training requests. He approached with the casual arrogance that had characterized his previous interactions, clearly expecting to find evidence that supported his preconceptions about supply personnel competence under pressure. "How are we doing with the rush orders?" he asked Kira, his tone suggesting he expected problems. "I know this kind of timeline can be overwhelming for people who are not used to operational pace." Kira turned to her computer screen and pulled up the status tracking system she had implemented to manage the accelerated schedule. "All requests submitted this morning are on track for tomorrow afternoon completion," she reported. "Ammunition coordination is confirmed with the armory. Specialized equipment is being pulled from warehouse stock, and transportation is arranged for final delivery." Webb seemed disappointed by her calm efficiency, having expected signs of stress or requests for deadline extensions. He glanced at Valdez, who was watching the interaction with growing interest, then turned back to Kira with renewed skepticism. "We'll see how things actually work out when the pressure really builds," Webb said dismissively. "Training exercises have a way of exposing weaknesses in support systems that look good on paper but fail under real stress." The comment revealed his determination to maintain his preconceptions regardless of contrary evidence. But Kira simply nodded acknowledgement while continuing her work. She had encountered similar attitudes throughout her military career and had learned that attempting to change minds through argument was far less effective than demonstrating competence through consistent performance. As the morning progressed, additional personnel arrived with various requests related to the compressed training schedule. Each interaction provided Kira with opportunities to demonstrate her efficiency and knowledge, but also gave her critics additional chances to reinforce their assumptions through selective interpretation of events. The pace was demanding but manageable for someone with her experience, and she found herself settling into the familiar rhythm of complex logistics coordination under pressure. Her movements remained calm and purposeful, while others around her showed increasing signs of stress related to the accelerated timeline. By midday, it became clear that the compressed schedule was creating challenges throughout the base. Various departments were struggling to adjust their timelines, and frustrated personnel were arriving at the supply depot seeking expedited service for their own urgent requirements. The pressure was building, and Kira found herself managing an increasingly complex web of competing priorities and conflicting demands. However, rather than becoming overwhelmed, she seemed to thrive under the increased pressure. Her organizational systems proved robust enough to handle multiple urgent requests simultaneously, and her technical knowledge allowed her to make informed decisions about equipment priorities and resource allocation. What others saw as crisis, she approached as simply another operational challenge requiring systematic solution. The afternoon brought additional complications as equipment suppliers reported delays and transportation schedules required adjustment. Several personnel who had submitted requests began expressing concern about their ability to meet training deadlines. And tension throughout the base continued to build as various units competed for limited resources and expedited service. Through it all, Kira maintained her professional composure while working systematically through each challenge. Her calm efficiency stood in stark contrast to the increasing stress visible in others, and even her critics began to acknowledge that their logistic support was holding up remarkably well under circumstances that had overwhelmed other base operations.